For anybody who does not have a book, we've got several up here, and of course we're not getting into them tonight in particular. It begins with chapter 1. We're still doing introduction. But anyway, they're here, and if we run out, we can order more. It's not a big deal. So don't be afraid to take the last one. Right, so last week we began by trying to put some things in its context, in their context within the book, and even how it relates to what we're dealing with. It addresses how the people of God interact with a culture that's hostile toward it, or at least just not in favor of the people of God. And so we spent some time looking at that, introducing some thoughts, and then spent some time looking at Daniel, his family line, his things along those lines. We looked at his ministry, and then some of the contemporaries that other prophets that were preaching at the same time he was. Daniel had one of the longest ministries, the longest prophetic ministries, really on record, 70 plus years probably, which we'll get into here in just a little bit. Jeremiah was 50-something, so he's one of the longest working prophets that God ever had. So as we think about Daniel the book, I want to give you this statement. He says, a comforting, encouraging message that even children can understand, talking about the first 6 chapters, at least until the last chapters of Daniel, and encounter fantastic mind-bending visions, along with bizarre numbers and enigmatic periods of time that leave even the most learned Bible scholars scratching their heads. That's one of the things about Daniel. You have, that we'll see, it's 12 chapters. You've got your opening 6 chapters of stories, narratives, whatever you want to call them. And then the second half is prophetic in its nature. And the first 6 chapters, you can always learn something new when you go to it, but it's also very hard to mess those chapters up. They are so straightforward. The second half, it leaves you shaking your head. We do our best, and I think we can get some good general ideas about what is going on. I'm pretty certain about that, but knowing every minute detail, I don't know. And we will deal more with that discussion when we get into, before we move into chapter 7, we will study at least a class or two talking about apocalyptic literature, which is what Daniel, the second half of Daniel is. It's what Matthew 24 is. It's what Revelation is. And trying to figure out how you navigate that type of a language and how far you're supposed to take the details of it. So anyway, we'll deal with that when time comes. As we think about the book, the author of this book most likely is Daniel. You look at places, and the one mentioned here in Daniel 7:1 and 2, Daniel speaks in the first person. He says, I, Daniel. And there are other places. Now, there are other places where Daniel is spoken of in the third person. Somebody says, this Daniel. But that's not necessarily a case. If you're writing a book, for an example, when I write a bulletin article, I write with I. I know technically you're not supposed to do that in highly technical writing, but I don't see the bulletin as a highly technical writing. Now, when it comes to manuscripts and papers and things like that, you have to refer to yourself into the third person, not necessarily by name, but this writer and this writer's judgment or opinion, something along those lines. It doesn't mean that I'm not writing it. It's just the way that the composition happens to be. And so it's not necessarily I'll put it this way, there are more references where Daniel is speaking in the first person than there are the third person where he's being spoken about. So it seems to make the most sense. And of course, Jesus makes mention of the prophet Daniel in Matthew 24 and verse 15, another apocalyptic text about the destruction of Jerusalem, when he says, and when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, then you are to know. And that's a reference to a couple of texts in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12. and we will get there and try and pull that apart a little bit. There's also language that Jesus uses that plays on an understanding of Daniel, okay? So when we're reading, first of all, we have to understand we're reading the Bible that was written in a cultural context, okay? And so what that means is the author doesn't go through and explain every nuance of what he's saying. He assumes that the reader will know some of this, okay? The same way I could talk to you if I'm sitting here tonight and talking to you and I say about George Washington. We all have a frame of reference for George Washington. I don't have to belabor that point, right? Now, you put me in India talking to a group of people about George Washington, I may need to provide context, right? So it depends. Now, when it comes to the Bible, the writers are assuming some things that are understood, that their audience will naturally pick up on without having to directly say, hey, this is what I'm talking about, okay? It's just one of the basic tenets of communication. Now, one of those is that Jesus uses is found in Daniel chapter 7. So in Daniel 7:13, verses 13 and 14, this is one of the early visions of Daniel. He says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So it says there's one like a son of man. Depending upon what translation you're using, it may say there came one with the clouds of heaven, the Son of Man. May not be any comparative terminology whatsoever. So Jesus picks up on this in his ministry. He will very often refer to himself as the Son of Man. Okay? For an example, in his trial, all right, in Matthew 26, he's in his trial before the Jewish courts, and they're trying to force his hand. And so in verse, let's just say 63, but Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you shall see the Son of Man. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Okay? Now, the connection between the phrase Son of Man and coming in the clouds of heaven, there are what we call verbal connections. Okay? That is, you see those same phrases used in Daniel 7. He's playing off of that. Okay? Now, I will say this. When it comes to the phrase Son of Man, there is debate upon its usage. Okay? Some people believe Jesus employed Son of Man to describe his humanity. Other people, based upon this text, say, no, it's a description of his deity, that he is God. I really don't think it's an either or. I think it's kind of a both situation. But that's one instance where Jesus is picking up on an image from Daniel, and he is using that language, obviously because the text is ultimately talking about him. And so he's using that language in the description of himself. In other places, like in the parable of the wheat and the tares, he will talk about the righteous shining forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Daniel 12:3, that's most likely an allusion to that. Those who are wise will shine out like the stars of heaven. And so there are some of those, when it comes to the authorship of Daniel, Daniel being a historical figure, Daniel, so many different things about it. Jesus gives a good deal of direct statements about Daniel, and then a whole bunch of allusions to Daniel in his ministry. So, most likely, Daniel is the writer. Obviously, the Holy Spirit is giving it, so it doesn't, whoever puts the pen to the paper isn't ultimately all that important. The date of the book is late 6th century, which would be in the what we would consider to be early 500s. You have to remember, when you're dealing before Christ, it's backwards of what you would think it would be. Okay? So if I said the late 20th century of American history, what am I talking about? 1980s, 90s. That's late 20th century, because time is counting upward. Old Testament time is counting down. So late 6th century would actually be like 510, 515, 520. And so this is most likely written sometime. Obviously, the reign or the nation of the Medes and the Persians are in control. And we see that shift take place in the book, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. So if you look, somebody read for us chapter 10 and verse 1. Okay, so in the third year of Cyrus, which this is the Cyrus of the end of 2 Chronicles 36 and at the beginning of Ezra chapter 1. He's a Persian king, okay? Who took them into captivity? Nebuchadnezzar, who is he's a Babylonian king. So there's been a national shakeup, is the point. Okay? For an example, let's look here again in Daniel 1. And we'll talk more about this next week when we get into chapter 1 more in detail. But it helps us with some time frames of what's going on. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So in there you have Jehoiakim, which we met in 2 Kings 24. And then you have Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon. And then in verse 21, it says, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. That's a Persian king. So in the opening chapter of the book, we're given kind of a broad picture of how much time we're talking about here. Okay? The Babylonian Empire lasts maybe 100 years. Okay? The captivity, which God had promised through Jeremiah, would be 70 years. And that started when Daniel and his friends were taken in this text in 606 BC. 606 BC. And then Babylon would be conquered in 539, and then Cyrus would allow them to return in 536. So there's your 70. So Daniel is peculiar in this sense. He touches a whole lot of time. Okay, so he was born and spent the first few years, probably into his early teens, in Judah. Okay, so he was born and raised in Judah up until his teens. Then he's carried into Babylon, where he serves the Babylonian Empire in the exile in Babylon, in captivity. But he also lives to see the end of the captivity. He's living into the first year of Cyrus, which is when he lets the people of Israel go back to their promised land. Now, Daniel probably doesn't go back because at this time, he's just too old for it. There's debate on his age, but I mean, you start looking at the numbers, he's getting into his 80s and 90s, which is highly unheard of at that time. So you can see why he doesn't go with them. But he touches those three periods of history: when the monarchy was still there, when they're taken into captivity, and then when the captivity is reversed and they're allowed to go back home. And so he's a peculiar character in that sense. All right. Languages in the book, and this is something that we're not going to see in English translation, although you might have a footnote or a margin reading that will tell you something is happening. So when we were kids coming up, we would ask the question, what language was the Bible written in, or what languages? The most common answer was Hebrew and Greek. And that's right, but it's not necessarily the fullest explanation either. predominantly in Hebrew in the Old Testament. There are portions of Aramaic. A large portion of Daniel, we'll see in just a minute, is written in Aramaic. It's very similar to Hebrew. As a matter of fact, it looks the same as Hebrew. But anyway, and then the New Testament, of course, is written in Koine Greek, which is its own dialect. So you've got Hebrew and Aramaic. There are also sections in Ezra, 2 sections in Ezra that are in Aramaic. Jeremiah 10:11, a random verse is in Aramaic, and Genesis 31:47, a random tag there is in Aramaic. So, and most likely, we don't know exactly what language the people spoke in the time of Jesus in Palestine. The most common consensus is that they spoke Aramaic. Okay? For an example, you saw the movie The Passion of the Christ. That was in Aramaic. Okay? It's Aramaic all the way through. It's subtitles, but it's Aramaic because that's the assumed understanding. Now, so there is a big Aramaic section, as we said. So in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 4, the first half of chapter 2, verse 4. If you'll see, chapter 2, verse 4 says, "Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic." From this point forward, all the way to the end of chapter 7, the book is written in Aramaic. Chapter 8 through the end, it's Hebrew. So you've got Hebrew at the beginning, a big chunk of Aramaic in the middle, and Hebrew at the end. So why is that? Well, most likely because Aramaic was the language of the court. Okay? Now, in this section of 2:4 through 7:28, it's dealing with a lot of the major world empires. It's very global in its scope. Okay? So in this book, we're going to run into major empires. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I understand this is a lot. I'll pause here in just a second and let you ask questions. Not that I'll know the answer. But Aramaic is the language of the court. And so these chapters 2 through 7 deal with a very global picture of what's going to happen with nations. When you get into chapters 8 through 12, you have a lot of visions, and there are nations that are involved, but the primary focus is really upon the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks, and not so much on them as the people of Israel, because the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks will be in control of the people of Israel. And therefore, Daniel's focus shifts. And so the rest of that book from chapter 8:4 being in Hebrew would make perfect sense. He's talking to them in their language about the things that are going to directly affect them with the details. So, and you can make the same argument in chapter 1. It's predominantly a Jewish focus. But that Aramaic section is more global in its focus. All right? Any questions about that? Okay. Let's look then at this next section as we think about the miracles of the book. So, one of the things we talked about when we looked at the ministries of Elijah and Elisha in the Kings is that some people, when they think about miracles, they think they're everywhere in the Bible. Except they're not. Okay? Part of what is a miracle is that it's supernatural. If they're everywhere, that's not uncommon. Okay? Actually, when you look at the Bible from beginning to end, miracles come in clusters, groups. Okay? For an example, the Exodus, the plagues, the wilderness wanderings, that's a cluster. All right? Then we go a long time and we're not told about any of them. Elijah and Elisha, they perform miracles, 7 and 14. That's a cluster. Then we read about these in Daniel. Then we read about Jesus and the apostles early on in Acts, and then they fade off. So miracles are not as common as people would lead some people to believe. And Daniel is one of these places where miracles are. And that has to do with its own study of the purpose of miracles and things along those lines. So there are 3 miracles in this book. That's 3, 5, and 6. And that is, of course, the fiery furnace in Daniel 3. That's the handwriting on the wall in 5, and Daniel in the lion's den in 6. Those are our miracle passages in this particular book. Miracles are used in times in which God is doing something extraordinary to move the story of redemption forward. And anyway, all right, let's think about interpretation here for a minute. Mistakes that come with interpretation, and there are many. I will say the biggest mistake that people make in interpreting Daniel or Revelation, and honestly, maybe even the whole Bible, is thinking that the Bible is about you. It's not. The Bible is about God, and it's about God's working in history, okay? And so one of the most prevalent mistakes, one of the sources that I've picked to consult and to kind of be with me in this, in my own preparation, he spent probably 20 pages just talking about the history of the interpretation of Daniel. And then he draws some conclusions at the bottom. And you can see it as you're reading what he's saying, people have said. And the number one mistake people make about Daniel is believing it's going to be fulfilled in their lifetime. Listen, Daniel has already been fulfilled. Does it make more sense for Daniel to be writing about things that are going to be fulfilled thousands of years later? Like when Christ returns the second time? Or does it make more sense to tell a group of people in captivity, no, I want to tell you about what's going to happen to you and your ancestors in the near future? That makes a lot more sense. And so when we study Daniel, people sometimes make some mistakes. They get into an allegorical approach where everything is like emblematic of something. When I took Revelation the second time, my professor in that class was talking to us, and he said, look, and he meant it. And, in that class, we were not allowed to mock any interpretation of Scripture. Which was something I appreciated because there's no point in that, and people believe it with sincerity. But some people, when they look at things like Daniel and they look at things like Revelation, they're like, this is the advent of the Apache helicopter. Pretty sure they had no clue what that was. Okay? So you get into these allegorical things where you start interpreting things. One of the things we're going to see in chapter 2, when we get to this image, we're going to talk about the legs of iron and the feet partly of iron and partly of miry clay. And even though Daniel interprets that for Nebuchadnezzar, some people say, yeah, but what about the toes? You have 10 toes, so that must represent 10 kingdoms. But Daniel doesn't say anything about the toes. You see, when you have an inspired person interpreting an image, you have to stick with what he's telling you. You can't branch out and try and find different interpretations. You have to actually stay where he is, because God is speaking through him saying, this is what this means. And those 10 toes some people thought it was the European Union, the advent of those nations that came together in the European Union. I mean, it can get fanciful. Obviously, I think the best approach to understanding this is a historical approach. What did it mean to the people who originally received it? And I think that makes sense. We do that with any historical document we find. We try to interpret it through the eyes of what the original hearers would have understood. It's not saying it doesn't have any applications or things that can be learned. It just means it makes the most sense to interpret it in the time in which it was written. So, ultimately, what Daniel is about is dealing with living in this hostile culture. And that's usually talked about a lot in the story section of the book, the first 6 chapters. And then in the second half, there's an emphasis upon, as we said, the Medes and the Persians, which are usually, that's one nation. And then you have the Greek Empire. And really, there's a large focus on this guy. You may have never heard of him, but by the time we're done, you're going to be sick of hearing about him. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Okay? When Alexander died, his kingdom was split amongst many generals. And Israel was caught between one of those splits. Okay? Like the actual land of Israel was caught between one of those splits. You had one part of it that was in control of Egypt and that southern border, and another like Antiochus, and some. You have the Ptolemies and the Seleucids is what they're called. And so with the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they fought over Israel. So the people of God were going to be what? Caught in the crosshairs of these two divisions of Alexander's kingdom who are going to be fighting all the time. And they're going to be forced to do things that will go against their faith. You ever heard of the Maccabees? Judas Maccabeus, some of those guys. It's not technically their name, Maccabee isn't, it's a name that was given to them, but where you get Hanukkah and some of those things today has to do with the Maccabean revolt from this issue. This is mentioned briefly in Daniel 11. But they're compelled to eat pork. They set up an idol in the temple. They're compelled to do that. Copies of Scripture are burned. They are compelled the men to reverse their circumcision. This has to do with the Greek way of life. And people say, what does this have to do with anything? A lot. Because when you come to the New Testament, you meet these people named Sadducees and Pharisees and Herodians, and they're not mentioned, but you have Essenes that also developed. Where did they come from? They came from the era after the Maccabees, and they were all trying to figure out, how do we handle the relationship of our faith to a government that is hostile to us? The Herodians and the Sadducees said, let's just go get in bed with the government. The Pharisees said, let's get away from it. The Essenes said, let's just leave society altogether. Okay? So, there are a lot of things that we're going to come in contact with when we watch this, but primarily that's what Daniel is going to be about, is dealing with a hostile culture, and especially in a time when hostilities are going to be ramped up during what we call the intertestament period, that 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. I think we've got time to talk about this very briefly. Daniel has been very influential. I don't have my copy with me, I don't think. So there are uninspired Jewish books. Some of them are known as the Apocrypha. For an example, if you purchase an Apocrypha, which I don't necessarily recommend, master the Bible books first and then deal with some of these. And that's not trying to be elitist, that's just saying there's a reason Protestants, that we have kept them out of the canon because they don't belong there. And it doesn't mean they don't have value, it just means they're not inspired. But you have three things like the Prayer of Azariah, which is an apocryphal writing where they kind of interpret Daniel chapter 3 when they're in the fiery furnace just walking around. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I've often wondered that. It's quite humorous to me to read Daniel 3 in that portion because it says Nebuchadnezzar looks in there and they're just walking around. Nobody else. If I'm in a furnace and I got thrown in and I've realized I'm still alive, I'm looking for the exit. I'm not walking around. Azariah, this prayer of Azariah is some person's musings on what they think happened. Or you have books like Susanna or Bell and the Dragon that also go, they're very short works, somewhat interesting. Many New Testament books, of course, allude to Daniel. And just close with this, there are modern literary and theatrical works. The Canterbury Tales from Middle English were highly influenced by the book of Daniel. There was a play of Daniel on Broadway for years and years and years. Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, was highly influenced by Daniel, as well as Nathaniel Hawthorne. Scarlet Letter, he was very skeptical of religion, but that's a whole different discussion. But anyway, Daniel has cast its influence, and it is a very interesting book, but it's also, I will tell you, so Kings was a study where we could come in here, and even though I didn't maybe, understand everything that was going on in Kings, it was pretty straightforward. You could see kind of, this guy's the king, this is what he did, he's gone. I'm always going to encourage people to prepare to come to Bible class, period. But I will say, when we get to the second half of Daniel, if we're not doing anything at home, it's going to be rough on us, okay? It will be rough. The only way to get these things, when you look at Daniel, you look at Revelation, there is no way I have the ability to make it so simple that I can give it to you in 30 minutes and you can walk away and understand everything. That's just not possible. I mean, I'm not that capable, and I don't really know anybody who is that capable. We're going to have to work. And I say that because Bible study is work. And especially in a book like this where the Bible and history and a lot of things are going to come together. And we're going to hear about people and things that we've probably never heard of before, okay? When I first took, my first class in preaching school was the intertestament period. 6 hours a day for 2 solid weeks. They were talking about people, and then you had to take Daniel. Then you had to do all that. So I'm just telling you, and I also want to say this because it can, and I realize what the time is. It's 7:29 technically. I've got it here by Apple's time, and it's right. I will say this. Don't be discouraged by running into difficulty. You are picking up more than you realize. Okay? And the first time around, it can be frustrating, but I promise you, you're getting more than you realize, and it will, at some point, you do have to dive in. So the first time around feels a little clunky. Second time around gets a little more familiar. Third time around, a little more familiar. And you start picking it up, and when you start reading it, you go, oh yeah, that's him, that's this, that's this, that's this. So, anyway, we will hopefully finish out. We've only got 2 or 3 things left in the introduction and then move into chapter 1 next Wednesday.